All right, so I'm going to start a unit on culture. Uh, and so this is one of my favorite chapters or favorite subjects to teach in sociology. I'm starting out this lecture with the photo of my niece and my nephew, and you can tell by the photo that they're at some sort of kind of school event. It's probably not very hard to figure out what they're up to. You can tell that my niece is dressed as a Native American. She's getting ready for Thanksgiving at her school, right? There's a pumpkin in the background, and you can see a straw bale, and you can see that she's kind of dressed up in a paper bag that's decorated to look like a Native American outfit. And so here we are. She's celebrating American culture and the celebration of the first Thanksgiving, right, in the school system. And the school system is busy socializing her into what it is to be a young citizen. So that's why I like culture. You can see culture everywhere. I'm sure that if you stop for 2 seconds to take a look around at your desk as you're watching this video, you'll see symbols of your culture around you. Maybe it's the necklace that your grandmother gave you, or maybe it's a photo of your friends, but you see elements of culture around you. And that's what this chapter's about. You know that humans are incredibly engaged in representing symbols that express their values and their beliefs, and that we're very, very good at reading symbols. And so, for example, here's a photo, and when you see this photo, you know instantaneously what this is capturing, right? So here are these first responders, these police and firefighters. They're at ground zero after the attack at September 11th, and they're raising the American flag. And so we know instantaneously that this is the symbol that says that we'll rise again, and that we're undefeated, and that the American spirit will go on, and that we will remember what's been done, but we will be strong and move forward, right? In a heartbeat, we can read that image for what it tells us. We can read this image and we know what it is. You look at it and you say, okay, that's the Mercedes-Benz logo. It symbolizes luxury. It symbolizes wealth. It symbolizes kind of an elite sort of status. Here's a symbol. This is a symbol of a circle of a wedding, right? It's the wedding ring, an engagement ring. So it symbolizes family and commitment and marriage. Here's a symbol. Maybe it's not as relevant to your cultural group, but for my cultural group, we instantaneously know that this horse has just won the Kentucky Derby. And so he won the Kentucky Derby and he gets to wear a blanket of roses. And I don't know if you know this, but Kroger makes that blanket each year, and there's over 40,000 roses in it. And so it's an important symbol for the person who owns that horse. And here's a symbol, of course, that you all know. You all know that you're part of the culture of BGSU. Here's a symbol. Here we are at a Jewish cemetery, and the Jewish cemetery has been defaced with the swastika. And so we know that this is a vandalistic act that's intended to say that that whoever put that on there has hostility and hatred towards Jews, right? And so we can read that symbol immediately and know that it's a hate action, right? And then here's a symbol of a cross burning. So I'm trying to show you all these symbols because I know that you're steeped in your culture, and you know how to read symbols, and it's interesting to think about the meaning, the cultural meanings that humans have for these. And so that's what this chapter is about. It's about culture. And so I want you to understand that when sociologists talk about culture, they mean that culture is a complex system of meaning and behavior that defines the way of life for a society. And so culture it consists of a number of really sophisticated things, including beliefs, values, knowledge, stocks of knowledge that people have, art, morals, our laws, our customs, our habits, our language, and how we dress. It encompasses everything. And so, for example, if you were going to go and celebrate a Jewish religious holiday, you would have to know the knowledge about how they want to serve their Seder and what goes on their plate and what the symbolic meaning of all the foods are, right? And when we have when Christian cultures have their Easter holidays, we know what Good Friday is, Palm Sunday. We know the build up and the lead up to the Easter ceremony, right? And so we have these cultural elements that we all know. And so what we know about culture is that it's shared. We share our culture, we share our foods, we share our songs, we share our symbols, and therefore it's learned. We're having to learn what the culture means. And that if we're socialized correctly, it's taken for granted. So when I go home for Thanksgiving, I take for granted my mother's going to make us a meal that has turkey and stuffing and cranberries, and There's a cultural story about how it fits in our family and how my grandfather and great-grandfather liked it. And so we kind of take things for granted. We're just socialized to accept our culture. And that it's profoundly symbolic, that these things that we take for granted have symbolic meaning, that they're speaking to us and telling stories to us. And something that's really important to realize is that culture varies across time and place. That something can mean one thing in one culture and an entirely different thing in another. And so another thing about culture is that it's both concrete and abstract. And so it's concrete in that you can observe cultural practices that define human experience. So if I went to a wedding ceremony, I would concretely see an exchange of rings. I would concretely hear the pastor or the officiator say the words that make this couple bring together. I would see what they wanted to wear. I would eat the food that they're giving me as part of the reception and the celebration. There's these concrete things that we have as an expression of culture. And that there's also an abstract culture. And it's a way of thinking and feeling and believing and behaving. And so, for example, when you go to church, if you go to church, or if you go to synagogue, or wherever it is that you may or may not go to a house of worship, you know that you have kind of a sense of feeling about how things are supposed to be and how they're supposed to feel. When you date someone, when you're reaching out to have an intimate relationship, your feelings about how you culturally do that will shape your feelings and your behaviors, right? And so that's abstract, these abstract feelings we have about how things should be. So there are three primary types of culture: material, cognitive, and normative. And so material culture consists of the way we physically modify the natural environment to suit our purposes. So how we lay out our cities, lay out our roads, what we do with nature, even how we kind of lay out agriculture. So do we do kind of farming that goes consistently with the lay of the land, or do we make straight rows? And so that expresses our cultural feelings, how we use the natural environment. And also material culture is the consumer goods that we make and that we produce, that we exchange, and that we use. There's also cognitive culture, and that's our mental and symbolic representations of reality. Often when we're talking about cognitive culture, we're talking about language. And so just to give you a quick example, I know that you're aware that like some cultures have more words for love than others. Some cultures, for example, Eskimos have far more words to express different qualities of snow, whether it's slushy snow or dry snow or icy snow, if it's a first snow or a late season snow, whereas we might just have very few words to express it, right? And so our cognitive culture is the way we symbolically represent values and meanings and beliefs to ourselves. And then there's normative culture, and that's the way in which we establish, abide by, and enforce principles of conduct, the norms that we have. And so we have mores, which are like our beliefs, our higher order beliefs about the nature of society or the nature of a higher being. So maybe like the Ten Commandments or laws. There are some norms that we think are so important that we express them in laws. So for example, in the Ten Commandments we have thou shalt not kill, but we think that that norm is so important that we actually have sets of laws for it, right? Other norms we think of that are important, but we don't necessarily have them expressed as laws. So for example, a norm is don't pick your nose, or don't pick your nose in public. We don't feel like we need to make a law about it, but we know it's a norm, right? It's a principle of conduct that we like to abide by. And so basically, when you think about it, culture is material, non-material, and symbolic. And so here's a photo of this young girl. This is from an ad in the 70s for Lego, right? And so here you got this young girl, and she's wearing overalls, and she's got this thing that she's made, this kind of city, and she looks so proud and happy. And it goes, what it is beautiful, right? And so this ad became really controversial in the last few years because now lately Lego's gotten in trouble for kind of making kits of Legos that are sort of gender specific. And so, for example, selling Legos that are like here's a Lego set to build a beauty parlor, and trying to sell that to girls, and then having more ones that are about race cars or other thing for boys. And so this woman who's in the ad now, she's an adult and she's a pediatrician, and she was brought back for an ad to kind of talk about, hey, how can we make culture that's about play gendered? Why does Lego have to be gender cultured? And so it's kind of interesting to think through how over time our feelings about culture can change. And so to express that, I want to take up this idea of the swastika again. And so when you see that flag in the upper right-hand corner, that red field with the white and then this cross in it, we see that and we instantly know that that's the flag of the Third Reich, that we know that that's Nazi Germany, right? And we see it as a symbol of hate, a symbol of domination, a symbol of evil, right? But if you look back in time, you can see that the swastika was used in other ways. And so there's a symbol, an art symbol that was made by Celtic peoples, right? So this ancient Celtic peoples. And what is it expressing is our connection to earth, our connection to fertility, our connection to the new seasons. In the middle, you can see how the Greeks were using it. So they've got this pot, and you can see that beneath the dogs, there's these little swastikas scratched in, right, in the symbols. And she's holding this, this woman is holding these birds. And so this is an urn that's expressing a goddess, right? And so here's a swastika being used in another way. And so again, I'm trying to show you that symbols can be taken and appropriated, and their meanings can be shifted over time. And so it's very interesting to see the purposes that people put into symbols. Okay, so it's interesting to kind of think about whether there are some cultural universals, things that are common practices or beliefs that are shared by all societies. And so the details of them may change, but it does seem as though most societies have athletic sports, most societies have customs around cooking and preparation of food, most societies, all societies basically, have funeral ceremonies and how they want to treat the dead or think of the dead or deal with the dead's body. All societies kind of have medicine and the social and cultural meanings of medicine. And then all societies kind of place sexual restrictions. Who are we permitted to have sex with? What is the way we can engage in sexual practices? Are there times in our life where sex is completely taboo and forbidden? And so it's interesting to look at how societies differ and how they treat each of these aspects of our social life. So now I'm going to want to talk to you about normative culture. And so normative culture is norms, basically our established standards of behavior that's maintained by society. And so we can think of norms in any number of ways. First, there are folkways. And so that's norms governing everyday behavior. So kind of norms like when you arrive at a door and somebody else has arrived, you hold the door open for them. When you're sitting in a lecture, you don't take phone calls and talk while a professor's talking. When you're in a movie theater, you don't smoke, right? You don't smoke while other people are trying to watch a film. It's just like when you're walking on the street, you look someone in the eye and give them a greeting, right? So we have these simple things that are kind of cultural elements of how we behave in everyday life or everyday routines. When we get on an elevator, we turn around and we give a little body space to the other people. If no one's by the buttons, we'll press the button ourselves, but if someone's right next to it, we'll kindly ask them to hit the floor we want. And so we have these folkways, like what we do just to get by in everyday life. And then we have mores, and those are norms that are deemed highly necessary for the welfare of society. So mores are kind of expressing our beliefs that we think are critical for the ongoing kind of the nature of our society. So for example, if you're Christian, the 10 Commandments are your mores. If you're Muslims, you would follow the 5 pillars of Islam. So you would believe in needing to pray multiple times daily, needing to go to Mecca on pilgrimage, needing to give alms to welfare and charity, needing to, what is it? The 5 pillars are needing to make sure that you say that there is only one God and Muhammad is his prophet. And so you have these kind of different things that express your higher order beliefs depending on what religious faith you are, right? And so it's really kind of interesting to think about that, how we have these beliefs that are really held up as critical ones. And then again, we've got like laws that are for kind of societal administration of norms that we think are critically important. So like laws about how we're going to deal in traffic, laws for whether we can commit crimes or not, and what the punishments should be. And so I want you to think about formal and informal norms. And so formal norms are norms that are generally written down and that specifies really strict punishments for violators, how we're going to deal with a problem. And so, for example, laws are formal norms. The university has formal norms, and so you know that there's a student code of conduct. If you violate the student code of conduct, you might see the undergraduate committee to see how you behaved in the dorms or whether you cheated on an exam. And so there's formal norms that might have sanctions against you. And then there's informal norms. And so these are for norms that are generally understood, but they're not precisely recorded. So for example, we have to kind of monitor each other. And so for example, if you're talking in a movie theater, no one can have you arrested necessarily, but they might turn around and give you a dirty look, right? You're disturbing them, disturbing the peace, and disturbing the norm of being considerate to people. So let's think about that. So if we were going to think about this as culture and cultural elements, how can we think about the elements and the examples of them? And so we've got mores, which are like religious doctrines or formal law. We've got values that we hold in our lives, like I value liberty and freedom. I'm sure you do too. I value taking care of my animals and being able to take care of them well. I value spending time with my nieces and nephew. We can have beliefs. Beliefs are a belief in a higher order being, or a belief maybe that there isn't an afterlife. So we have these beliefs about higher level statuses in our society. And so it's interesting to kind of look at that. What are different kinds of elements? So I want to stop for a moment and really specifically think about norms, okay? And so when you think about all the norms in life that might be out there, what's interesting is that not all norms are followed in all situations, right? And so what your friends might find acceptable is entirely different than what your teacher might find acceptable. And so, for example, if you're out at a restaurant with your friends, you might all be sitting there with your telephones out, and that you might be sitting there texting or Snapchatting, or you might even show your friend what so-and-so has texted to you. And so it's not a violation of kind of your understanding about how you sit through a meal together. But if you were behaving that way in class, it might violate the teacher's norms, right? The teacher doesn't want a table of students sitting there sharing texts and laughing about Snapchat or Yelp, or getting on Yelp and that kind of things. And so we know that not all norms are followed in all situations. And if they're weak, they may be ignored entirely. And so your grandmother may have told you, when you get to a door, you open that door for whoever's there. But if she's not around and it doesn't seem like it's necessary, you might not hold the door for someone. So for example, if you're going to Olds Camp and there's a stream of people going through the door, you might just pass through the door along with them and not hold it for the next person. And so we know weak norms might be ignored. And that sometimes they might be violated if there's a norm conflict. So for example, say you're a young man and your grandmother really kind of raised you to be kind of chivalrous and to be considerate and courteous and to treat women in a way that kind of, in your mother's or your grandmother's point of view, signifies respect, right? Like you treat women so courteously that you open the door for them, open the car door for them, that kind of thing. But say that you're meeting young women in college, and young women in college, while wanting to be treated with respect, don't want you necessarily to be chivalrous. And so you might not open the car door for a woman, or you might not open the door for her to pass through, because that's kind of violating, the norms that she has. And so sometimes we violate our own norms when we come into conflict, depending on the social situation. And so basically, adherence to norms are really contingent on political and economic and social conditions around us. And I think that that's kind of really an interesting thing about them. So another thing that's really important to think about norms is, remember when I was talking to you last week in the theory lecture, I was talking to you about the symbolic interactionism and about kind of front stage and backstage behavior. Irving Goffman said that, hey, if our society is kind of socializing us into cultural norms so well that they become so taken for granted that we can't even say what the norms are. So if somebody came to interview us and said, what are all the norms that you live by? You wouldn't even be able to do it. It would just be too hard. And so what he liked to do is what he called breaching experiments. And I told you about an example that he did with his students. But he really felt that the only way you could get people to kind of see the norms, because a fish can't see the water it's swimming in, is to violate a norm to see how people get really uncomfortable until they can kind of reestablish the norm again. And so I want you to think about that. Like, how might you feel if you're walking on campus and you see a woman, a college woman, and she's clearly dressed in kind of her Sunday finest or her best clothes, and suddenly she spit on the ground? That would be kind of a violation of a gender stereotype norm that we might have. How might you feel if you were driving on the street and suddenly somebody decided they're going to drive in the lane that you're in, except coming straight at you? You'd feel very strongly about the norms of traffic, right? And so it's interesting to think through what are the norms that are constantly around us. And so anyway, as we are people in the world living these norms, watching other people do the norms, violating the norms or fulfilling them, we're all engaging in sanctions. And that sanctions are penalties and rewards for conduct concerning a social norm. Okay? The word sanction sounds really negative, but it's not always negative. You can give someone a reward as a sanction. And so, for example, if you wanted to positively sanction someone, you might give them a pay raise, you might give them a medal, you might give them a word of gratitude, maybe you'll give them a gift. That you're trying to kind of give them a positive sanction for fulfilling norms that you think are important. So, for example, I'm hoping that my boss thinks I'm a good teacher and will eventually give me a raise, right? If you're a good soldier, maybe you will earn a medal. And so there's positive sanctions for norms. And then there's also obviously negative sanctions. And so negative sanctions can be fines, prison sentences, that kind of thing, threats, but they also can be kind of informal sanctions. So, for example, have you ever been given the cold shoulder by somebody? That would be a sanction, that they felt like you violated the norm of friendship, and now they're giving you the cold shoulder. If you're texting in class and the professors ask you to stop, they might give you a kind of a cross look, and that's a negative sanction. And so I want you to think about the positive and negative sanctions that you've received for fulfilling norms around you. Now I'm going to step back and talk to you about, let's think about different cultural groups in society. And so the first major one is thinking about dominant or mainstream culture. And so mainstream culture, if you were going to give it a definition, is the culture of the most dominant group in society, and the mainstream culture is kind of supported by the major institutions of society. And so it's given a degree of legitimacy based on its power to set the stage of acceptable norms, values, beliefs, and customs. And so it's the accepted culture despite the presence of other cultures in society. And so you might have a really diverse, society. Like we are a continental-sized landmass with some of the most racially and ethnic diverse populations on Earth, with a variety of wealthy and poor people, of a variety of different religious backgrounds, but there's still a dominant culture or a mainstream culture. And so it's kind of interesting to think through what are the features of that mainstream culture and how are they represented to us in law, in political realm, on the TV shows that we watch, on the podcasts that we listen to, on Facebook as it comes to us through ads, like how do we see the presentation of mainstream culture. Now this is where it's interesting to look at different theories about it. So for example, Karl Marx would say that the capitalists are in charge of mainstream culture and that they're using all of their power to make the major institutions keep the working class powerless, right? And so they would use religion to tell people who are poor, hey, don't be worried about being exploited in this world, just focus on your heavenly reward. And that they would have educational institutions teaching people how to be obedient and be good workers. And so it's interesting to think through how we're kind of controlled by a mainstream culture and what we're expected to believe and how we're expected to behave in mainstream culture. So there are other kinds of cultural groups. So for example, there's subcultures and countercultures. And it's important to understand the difference between the two. And so a subculture is a group whose values and norms differ from the mainstream. And they can either be integrated with the mainstream, really integrated pretty well, or they can be isolated, but they share dimensions of mainstream culture. And so basically they have their own values and norms, their own customs and practices, their own language for things, and their own kind of desires to interact with each other, but they're not necessarily trying to overthrow society or impose their culture on others, that they just want to be able to enjoy their subculture. A counterculture, on the other hand, is a subculture that's created as a reaction against the values of mainstream society. And they're rejecting mainstream values for their own political or moral reasons. They want to be nonconformists to the dominant culture, and they want to develop cultural practices that defy mainstream norms, values, and beliefs. And so this can be really relatively extreme. This can be somebody who's countercultural, who's trying to overthrow society. So, for example, in the 1960s, people were joining something called Students for a Democratic Society, and they wanted to overthrow what they saw was a fascist government and make it more democratic. They wanted the United States to get out of the war. And so they were a real strong countercultural movement, right? But they were relatively pacifist. People like the militia or the Ku Klux Klan or terrorists are a counterculture that are willing to use kind of violent means to do overthrow of mainstream culture. A subculture, on the other hand, are people who kind of just similarly enjoy the same values. So, for example, I ride horses practically every single day, and I hang out with people who love horses and own horses and show horses, and we constantly talk about vets and farriers, and we compare each other's saddles and bridles, and we give each other advice about how to ride horses and care for our animals. Like, it's all in our mind all the time. And we really enjoy that, and we enjoy our special clothing and our special customs, and we enjoy knowing about the same famous horses. But we have no interest in overthrowing America, right? We just want to enjoy our particular lifestyle within it. And so you might want to think through, what are some subcultures that you belong to, okay? All right. So then let's think about language, and I'm going to spend a few minutes now talking in particular about language in detail. And so language is a system of shared symbols, and it can include speech, it can include written characters, it can include numbers, it can include symbols, it can include nonverbal gestures as forms of communication. And so language is this really kind of complex thing that comes at you in written, physical, and oral forms, right? And so there's this theory called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And what it says is that, hey, language is not given. Language really varies across cultures and societies and throughout history. Language is really culturally determined. Cultures create language to express their values and beliefs and the way they want people to think and feel. And so basically, language really colors how we see the world. And that language can transmit gender, race, and class stereotypes. And so, for example, you know that parents are often trying to make sure their children are very careful about language. Like, don't use foul language or profane language. Don't use language that bullies or harms people emotionally. And so we're really concerned with how language creates society and culture and bonding. And so I want to talk to you about kind of different examples of how sociologists might care about language. I'll give you an example from my own horse world again. So if you went down to Paris, Kentucky, which is one of my favorite places in the entire United States, this is a city, a small city off of Lexington, that has a number of really famous horse farms. So Claiborne Farms, where Secretariat lived, for example. There's another farm that I visited recently where my thoroughbred, her great-grandfather, Count Fleet, is buried. And so an enormous amount of people are employed in the horse industry, in the horse racing industry. And so they have specialized language for newborn racehorses. They have specialized language for the colors of horses. They have specialized language for the different kinds of jobs. And so, for example, there's something called a pinhook. And a pinhook is a special word for somebody who, in the spring, they go around to these farms, not to all the famous farms, but to all the smaller farms, and they see, of the babies that are born, the thoroughbred horses that are born, which ones are likely to be really astonishingly good. And they try to buy those before they just kind of grow up or go to auction or are sold or gotten rid of in other ways. And so this pinhook's job is to go and see, hey, of the farms that are not famous, what farms are producing really special animals. And how would know that? If you weren't a part of that culture, how would you know pinhook means that? And so it's kind of interesting to think through how there's really specialized language for different subcultural groups. Okay, so anyway, language is interesting because it also can reflect the social and political status of different groups in society. And so, for example, way back, in the 70s and 80s, there was this huge controversy over using the word working woman. So we saw during the 70s that more and more women were entering paid employment. They were entering the marketplace. And that people were kind of throwing around the media the rise of the working woman. And so, of course, stay-at-home mothers got really angry because, of course, they're working too, right? And so there was this fight over the meaning of that term, working woman. Then there's that interesting thing about what we do when we're trying to give people respectful designations. And so we know when we're trying to give a man respect, we simply call him Mr., right? Mr. Brown. But for women, we have to sort through how we're going to give a respect based on marital status. Do we call her Miss? Do we call her Mrs.? If we think that she's feminist or we're trying to be neutral, should we call her Ms.? And so you can see that we're treating women kind of differently when we give honorifics to show respect. Another example is kind of looking at in the 2012 election, the GOP, the Grand Old Party, was talking about legitimate rape, right? And so they had this language for talking about how if women are sexually assaulted, they can't get pregnant if it's really a rape, because women's bodies will shut down. Now we know biologically that's nonsense, right? We know that medically there's no justification for that. But it was interesting to see the use of that language, legitimate rape, right? That there's some forms of rape that are legitimate and other forms are people either lying or they're not telling the truth. So that's a really controversial kind of political motivation for using language. And then, of course, there's the everyday kind of controversies over people using the N word or the B word, right? I don't even feel comfortable putting the words down in writing for you here. And so basically, it's interesting to think about Language can shape people's perceptions of groups and events in their society. And so one of the cultural stories we tell ourselves is that Columbus discovered America, right? And when we say that, we no longer kind of believe that because we acknowledge, hey, there were Native Americans here before Columbus ever arrived. And then another thing that's really important is that it looks like there may have been Nordic peoples that arrived even before Columbus, right? But the story of his discovery makes it seem as though the United States was here, ready to be discovered by someone, right, and to be taken over. So it's a special use of language. If you look at the history of the development of our country and when the Continental Congress was working on our U.S. Constitution, there was a big debate about how to have that initial language. And so I know you know how to end the sentence, right? A life, liberty, and the pursuit of, and you're all probably saying happiness, the pursuit of happiness, we know. But really at the time, people were having this big fight within the Continental Congress. They wanted the sentence to say that we have the right for the life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. But they had a big fight because we knew that the northern states were fighting with the southern states even then about whether people could be property, right? Whether slaves were permitted to be owned. And there was also the concern that not everyone was going to be given the right to pursuit of property, that women were not going to be permitted to vote and have property independently of their kind of the spouses or fathers, and that slaves themselves would not be able to have property. And so they decided to go with happiness because they couldn't handle that word, property, right? And so it's interesting to think about how we are kind of shaping ourselves and shaping our cultural understandings. Language can also distort actual group experience. So I know that for myself, it's always really difficult in my research when I want to look at Hispanics. I don't really know, should I use the word Hispanic? Should I use Latino? I know on campus in BGSU there's a big dialogue about whether it should be Latinx to represent both Latino and Latina. I know that even if I choose Hispanic, Chicano, or Latino, that I'm kind of bunching together really distinct groups of people like Mexican Americans, island Puerto Ricans, U.S. native-born Puerto Ricans, people from the Honduras, Panamas, El Salvador, Central and Southern American countries. And so the way we use language often kind of lumps people or hides their experiences, right? And that's really unfortunate. There's also ways that's interesting to look at how groups sometimes advocate or create social movements around language, that they're trying to change the way we use language or symbols of language. And so, for example, political controversies over whether we call someone disabled or handicapped versus medical designations, like what do they actually really have, or do we call them differently abled? There's also concern about using Native American instead of Indian. And so in the 1970s, there was the rise of a Native American movement to try to stop people from being careless about either acknowledging people's specific tribal heritages or calling them the first people or Native Americans, right? And we also can see this spilling over with controversies over sports teams. Like, do we call a team a Redskin team, right? And so we know that we have these kind of big debates about it. We know over the course of our U.S. history, we've had different ways that we've called our black citizens, right? And so sometimes we've called them Negro or colored. We've replaced that by black, African American, or black American. Sometimes we use people of color. That we're really kind of talking about what do we mean when we use a particular term. A friend of mine does research on sexuality, and so she's really interested in the word polyamory. That she thinks that, hey, we spend so much time focusing on monogamy that we should acknowledge that some people really are interested in engaging in romantic and intimate and sexual relationships with multiple people. And instead of stigmatizing it, why don't we create a word that expresses that impulse? And so polyamory is a word to express that. You also know that there are more people who are kind of demanding that we be careful about pronouns. So instead of always referring to he or she, they want pronouns that are more neutral to kind of support and respect transgender and LGBTQ populations. And so that's kind of an interesting kind of change in our meaning of language. So something that I think is interesting for sociologists is to study and pay attention to when people reclaim language or reclaim material or non-material culture, and that they see something that has really derogatory and demeaning intentions. And so people using language to try to humiliate, to shame, and to demean a culture or a group of people. And that some people try to reclaim it, right? And so we know that there's lots of women and who call each other B, call each other the B word, right? And so they say, hey, you're my B. And that what they mean is they mean that they're powerful and entitled and beautiful and caring, and that they can do what they want, and that this is their friend. This B person is their friend, that they're showing bonding, right? And so they're taking this word that has historically negative content and they're trying to use it positively, right? Or else when blacks are using the N word, blacks or people of color, not Native Americans, when blacks or people of color are using the N word, whether in cultural artifacts like music or whether in how they call each other, that there's this big debate about whether they're doing it to try to reclaim its negative content uh, and whether whites are permitted to use it as well. And so it's interesting to kind of think through the taking over pejorative terms. And so I have an example in my own life. I call it the Aunt Jemima example. And so here they are. This is salt and pepper shakers, right? And so if you get on the internet, you can see that there's so many different kinds of Aunt Jemima salt and pepper shakers, right? And that people are engaged in collecting them. It's kind of a folk art thing, right? But when you look at them, it's kind of astonishing that we know that this Aunt Jemima as a symbol is supposed to be the symbol of the happy slave, the house slave, who happily takes care of the plantation owner's children. And in fact is more interested in taking care of the plantation owner's children than maybe even her own children. That she's the happy, cooking and caring house slave. And so when you look at it, it's really a racist symbol. It's a really highly unusual and controversial racist symbol, right? And so one time I had this graduate student, and I went to her home, and I saw, she was a black graduate student, and she invited me to her home for dinner, and I went, and she had an entire filing or cabinet, kind of a knick-knack cabinet, and it was filled from floor to ceiling with these salt and pepper shakers, and I couldn't believe it. I was floored. And so I turned to her and I asked her, "What on earth are you doing with these Aunt Jemima things?" And she turned to me and said, "What on earth is your culture doing making these things?" And so it was just kind of like this mind-blowing moment of kind of realizing, wow, she's really right that, my culture made these things. What are their purposes? And what is she trying to do by collecting them and reclaiming them and kind of holding them up as a symbol of hate? And so it's interesting. I'd like you to kind of look around at the world as you see it. So like when you go to the fair, you know that you're going to see a symbol of a kind of a Confederate flag. You might see it on a belt buckle, or people are buying T-shirts with it. And so it's interesting to kind of stop and think through who made that and why. What does it represent? Okay, so now let's kind of talk about some more definitions. We're almost done with the lecture here. So ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is judging a culture by standards of your own culture. And so, ethnocentrism can have kind of good qualities to it. It can help you build group solidarity. It can make you feel like you're bonded, you're valuing your own culture, and you're enjoying your own culture, and you want to be with others who like your culture. But it also can be profoundly negative. And so if you're ethnocentric, it discourages your understanding and a true social exchange between cultures, that you're not comfortable sharing or learning about other cultures. And in its more extreme forms, it can lead to conflict, war, and genocide. So, for example, I know that when I lived in New Orleans, I lived in New Orleans for a while. I had a Jewish friend, and I wasn't able to go home for the holidays. And so I asked my Jewish friend, "Hey, would you like to come over to my home and celebrate Seder?" And so she's like, "Yeah." And she didn't have a whole lot of, she didn't think negatively. She was happy to spend the holiday with me, right? And so I invited some of our friends. And I know that she thought that, she's coming over for a meal, we'll probably serve some fish meal, it'll be fun. But she didn't know. I was doing research. I was trying to figure out what is she going to need to read as a script to talk about the night. What is she going to need on the plate that has all of the elements to celebrate it. She's going to need a matzah. She's going to need a particular kind of cracker. She's going to need an egg. She's going to need something that is kind of tastes really good and sweet. There's going to be all these elements that she needs. There's going to need to be candles. There's going to need to be an empty chair for the prophet who will come. There's got to be a lot of wine because there's drinking of wine in between each of the stories that are told. And so when she arrived, she was kind of floored. I didn't get everything right. I certainly didn't do a great job, but she could tell I was trying. I was trying to get things set up for her so she could lead our special meal. And so if you can kind of suspend your ethnocentrism, you might have more opportunities kind of to learn from different cultures or to have an exchange. Okay, another example I have, and then I'll move on, is during the election last year, Khizr Khan came to Toledo area. And I don't know if you know him, but he's the man, the father whose son died during a terrorist attack. He was a soldier of the U.S., and he died trying to protect his soldiers, right? And so Khizr Khan was going around giving talks about how important the election was and his feeling about what it is to be an American, right? And so he was going to be at the the Toledo Greater Islamic Center up in Perrysburg, right? And so I went, and it was amazing. It was really amazing to see all the Christians there and Jews there and Muslims there, and then people who were atheists, people of different kinds of faith there, to hear this man speak. And so these were people who wanted to have a cultural sharing of ideas. Okay, so then a couple last definitions. Popular culture. Popular culture are the beliefs, practices, and objects that are part of our everyday traditions. It's mass-produced, it's mass-consumed, we can't get away from it, we're often producing it ourselves, we're kind of complaining and talking about it and sharing it, and so it has enormous significance in the formation of our public attitudes and our values, and it plays a real significant role in shaping patterns of consumptions. So, for example, I'm a total Apple person, right? I have to have my iPhone, and I'm interested in how it's getting developed. Other people are interested in the Android phones, so we're really kind of talking about the different ups and downs of these different kinds of products. Some people want to have Fitbits. I want to have the Apple Watch, but I only want it when they finally get it untethered from the phone. And so popular culture is that knowledge, like all these things, these objects, practices, beliefs, the different songs that we care about at any given time, how we use Snapchat and its different filters, whether we should be on Instagram as compared to Facebook. And so it's really interesting to think about how popular culture might have a hold on us. And tying into this is mass media. And so basically research is showing that the average person is consuming some form of media 71 hours per week. That's 10 hours per day, right? And so you think that that's astonishing. That can't be. But figure it. Stop and figure it. You can't open Facebook without an ad being thrown at you, right? The TV is usually kind of ubiquitously on. If when you're in the union, the TV is even on, kind of being shown at you. There's all sorts of ways that content is being aimed at us. We're on the internet kind of constantly. And so we get a lot of mass consumption of media. 95% of all homes in the United States have at least one television. And that's more than have televisions or telephone service. And that when you look at America, American culture is especially TV oriented. And so in surveys, that's the highest category. When Americans are asked, what's your favorite kind of leisure activity? 26% of Americans say TV is their favorite way of spending an evening, right? That's very different as compared to other cultures. And so other cultures like in France, reading for pleasure, reading fiction and sharing that with others is something that's more popular than TV. And so I want you to think about the ubiquity of digital distractions, the way our culture is really being reframed by the varieties of digital distractions that we have. So texting each other, calling each other, Snapchatting each other, Facebook messaging each other, watching videos, sharing videos, listening to podcasts. All these ways are really kind of redefining how we have social interactions. Okay, so last few things. Cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony is a term that's talking about the pervasive and excessive influence of one culture throughout society. And so this acknowledges that culture is really highly politicized, right? That it matters to people which culture is winning. It matters to people what values and beliefs are out there. And so those who control cultural institutions also basically controls people's political awareness because they kind of can create cultural beliefs that make the rule of those in power seem inevitable and right. So I'm going to talk to you about kind of a controversial example right now. You know that in our culture, there's a real strong kind of public disagreement about the news, right? And so there's people who watch Fox News, people who watch CNN or MSNBC, other people who are reading the New York Times and Los Angeles Times, that kind of thing. And there's this real intense debate about whether we're putting ourselves into silos, that we're only getting news that conforms to our beliefs. And so it's a really interesting debate because it's talking about, hey, are some news sources truly trying to shape our cultural belief systems? Are some news sources basically trying to be propagandistic or not? And so that's what cultural hegemony is about. Like, are there kind of mass consumption of society that politically powerful groups are trying to endorse, to try to kind of control our belief systems and our behaviors? Okay, so cultural capital, and then there's two other slides that I'm going to talk to you about that are about cultural lag and cultural change. Cultural capital is really important. And in fact, I'm having you read an article by Annette Lareau, who's the president of the American Sociological Association. and she's really interested in studying this notion. Cultural capital was kind of invented by a theorist named Pierre Bourdieu. And Pierre Bourdieu, he's kind of a symbolic interactionist. He's really interested in the meanings that people kind of create in their social life and the meanings they give to different relationships and different kind of cultural products, right? And so cultural capital refers to the cultural resources that are specially designated as being worthy and that give advantages to groups possessing such capital. And so, for example would be wealthy people knowing what to wear at parties, where to go on vacation, what cars to buy, what are the best private boarding schools, which fraternity their son should join when they go to Harvard. Like, that's cultural capital, right? Knowing what to do and having the resources to get it done. Cultural capital is also social capital. So, for example, I might not be able to go to put my son in the right fraternity at Harvard, but maybe I know somebody who can get them a good job, right? And so I might have social networks, and that's a form of capital. It's not just wealthy people that have cultural capital. Everybody has different cultural capital. So, for example, in my world, my horse world, I have cultural capital. I know a lot of people, I know a lot of vets, I know a lot of different trainers. And so when I have problems, I know who to reach out to, right? So I have cultural capital within my community. In Bowling Green, Ohio, some people, like young people, they might not be from rich families, but they have cultural capital because they've been busy in 4-H, they've been a young youth leader, they've been an FFA in high school, and so they've built up a stock of expertise and knowledge and cultural capital within their group, right? And so it's interesting to think about the purpose and nature of cultural capital. And then there's cultural lag. So lag means that your culture changes, and it can change either rapidly or slowly because of social conditions, right? And so over time, as women are working more, maybe people get more comfortable with feminist ideas. Or over time, as women are working more, maybe we get a change in our ideas about men as caregivers for children. So over time, slowly things change, right? But then there might be rapid change. So there might be an enormous technological change that causes culture to change, pretty rapidly, and people are uncomfortable with it. So, for example, in 1963, we invented the birth control pill. And then women could almost have 100% control over their fertility, right? And it took a while. We had a sexual revolution. It took a while for people to get comfortable with what that means, right? And to this day, we're still a little bit uncomfortable about it. We don't know how much we really do want women's sexual liberation. And so that's an example. Another example is during my lifetime, there weren't cell phones. And so it's amazing to me to see the rapid change in our cultural connections to each other because of the rise of the cell phone, right? And always having the cell phone with us. And so when culture changes rapidly, you can get culture shock. And culture shock is this sense of kind of disorientation or uncertainty about what something means, right? What this change means for society. And so basically the last thing I want to talk about is thinking about sources of cultural change. Why does culture change? So one might be a change in societal conditions. So your culture might change if you have rising affluence. Like a growing middle class might give people more of an opportunity to think about, hey, maybe I'd like to get higher education and travel the world. And so cultural change might be because of change in societal conditions. Another might be cultural diffusion. So for example, there's some sociologists who study the rise of people accepting birth control, and they find that often it's because one culture will tell another culture, hey, this is how we're kind of controlling and restricting our fertility. Maybe you want to use it. And so the cultural diffusion of an idea that people want. Another might be innovation. And so, for example, it wasn't that long ago at all, that Steve Jobs said that he wanted to put 1,000 songs in our pocket. And that innovation has really profoundly changed a lot, right? It changes a lot how we consume mass culture. It changes the music industry. It has made enormous changes. And then the other thing is that it can be an imposition of cultural change by an outside agency. And so a really kind of horrific example is the attacks at a 9/11, right? That was a cultural change by terrorists, that we really kind of changed what we think we are as a people in a society in America because of that. But it doesn't have to be something as negative as that. It can be an imposition of cultural change by an outside agency, for example, like the Supreme Court, when they had their Brown versus Board of Education. And so an outside agency says that we will have equality in education, and then therefore our culture changes. And so I want you to think about what are norms that you're living by, what subcultures you belong to, what sanctions you've received. I'm hoping that you'll know these terms pretty well for the midterm that comes up. You take care.